Hey, everybody. So today we're going to talk about economics and politics. And so this is going to be your lecture for chapter 13 in your textbook. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we will get started, okay? All right, so we're going to start with a few definitions. Um, and this is just to kind of get us geared up for what it is we're learning. So the economy is really the system of production and exchange that provides us material needs for individuals living in a given society. So we've had multiple different economic systems throughout time. We've had systems like the barter system. We've had systems that exchange um, goods and services, right, for other goods and services. You have had systems like the current one we live in, which is capitalism, where you're exchanging goods for a material, monetary, like substance. So at different points in history, this was coins. Other points in history, this was gems. But currently, we trade money for goods and services. And capitalism also has several other features, which we're going to talk about in another slide, I'm sure. But really, that's the system we're in, and that's kind of the important key point there. Um, they control essentially what the social order of the world is. And by that, we mean that class or what economic level you are at within your society really impacts an individual's all of their social interactions, but it also limits your options, your opportunities, or garners you certain kinds of influence and social networking. And all of these things impact how you get to walk through society. Modern economies differ substantially from traditional ones because the majority of the population is no longer engaged in agriculture. Again, so farming was the main source of income or main source of getting your needs met for most people during pre-industrialization, um, all the way through the and all the way back to essentially nomadic cultures, where they moved for their resources and moved around a lot within their any given space. All right, so power and authority. These are something that we're going to talk about a lot, and we have talked about a lot when we come to sociology. And that's just because when we're talking about any kind of system that differentiates people by statuses, those statuses carry an amount of power or authority depending on where you are on any given hierarchy, right? And so power is just the ability of individuals or members of groups to achieve aims or further their interests they hold. Power is a persuasive element of all human relationships. Another way to think about power is power is the ability um, to essentially take your thoughts or opinions or um, influence or monetary gains and impact other people in some form or fashion, whether that be power over somebody's thoughts, power over somebody's situation, power over somebody's economic prosperity, power over somebody's physical abilities or physical movement. All of those are recognized as power, right? So it's the ability to influence someone else based on something that you have. Authority is the government's legitimate use of power. So it's that ability to take the power that they have been given or have taken and then essentially use it to impact how society operates. Um, and again, they're talking about it in a governmental sense, but authority can also be within different institutions, can be given to particular job statuses, et cetera, et cetera. But for the purposes of the politics and economic discussion, they're going to be talking about it in a governmental sense. All right. So a state is, okay, so we have states like Kentucky is a state, right? When we're talking about state, particularly in this chapter, we're talking about state as a rule, a political apparatus, government or with governmental institutions that plus civil service officials ruling over a given territory order whose authority is backed by law or the um, ability to use force. So a state isn't just like, hey, we have Kentucky where we have a governmental institution that rules over the particular area of Kentucky whose authority is backed by the US federal government and the Kentucky's state government, right? But we're talking about state as in like also nation states, which are a particular type of states that are characteristic of the modern world in which governments hold sovereign power within a defined territorial area, and populations are citizens who know themselves to be part of that single nation. So essentially, a nation state is going to be something that we're not going to like, that's going to be something like the US or something like um, France or something like um, West Africa, right? Like, so these are particular um, geographical borders, right? They have specific borders, and these borders mean something in an international way, right? So the state of Kentucky isn't a nation state, right? It is part of a nation state of the US, but it is not something that holds its own sovereign power. And that's a big deal. The sovereign power is something that essentially everyone around you acknowledges that this is its own entity with its own group of people, with its own governmental status that does not have a governing body over it, right? And so that's the important part there and the differentiation. All right. Territories ruled by traditional states were also poorly defined. You know, their borders constantly changed. Their level of control or central government was really weak. This contrasts with the modern sovereignty observed today, right? So we have to acknowledge that the US is the US, right? We can't just randomly walk into Canada and say, hey, this is now the US, ha ha ha, right? That would create a lot of issues. Just the same way Canada acknowledges that US's border is here, right? We acknowledge that this is the border and these two nation states are sovereign from each other. Okay. And sovereignty is just, again, the undisputed political rule of a state over a given territory or area. Citizens are members of any particular group or place that have both rights and duties associated with that membership. So essentially, you are a citizen of a particular area or specifically nation state if you have both rights and duties that are associated with that nation. So not only do you have the ability to do XYZ because you are a citizen, but you're also required to do XYZ. An example of this is in the United States, you have the right to vote. You have the right to certain kinds of governmental assistance. You have the right to all of the things that it lists in our Constitution. However, you also have a duty to make sure that you can prove you are a citizen. You have a duty to make sure that you are defining yourself in the census. You have a duty to make sure that you are, again, documenting yourself in the way of getting your license, making sure you're paying taxes, all of these things, right? These are the duties and rights, essentially, not all of them, obviously, but some examples of what you would need to be a citizen or considered a citizen within this country. And those things are different than some of the rights and duties maybe in other nation states, right? Because we don't operate all nation states in the exact same way. We just acknowledge that they are sovereign from another country. They're different from another country, and their citizens have to do what is viable to that particular nation state. All right. although some people are stateless, and that's really when you're talking about political refugees, somebody that is fled war-torn area, somebody that is fled because of harm or danger to themselves, that is possible, things of that nature. And that would make you essentially not a citizen anymore of the country that you left, and not a citizen of the country that you are currently in as a refugee at that juncture. Now, that doesn't mean you can't earn citizenship in that state. It means that at that political moment, or at that moment in time, you are political refugee, in the sense that you do not have a particular nation state that you currently are operating as a citizen of. Oops, I went too far back. Let's go back. All right. Nationalism is a set of beliefs or symbol expressing identification with a national community. So this is essentially where citizens of a particular nation, state, or country are essentially saying, hey, this is who I belong to. This is how I show that. This is how I express that, et cetera, et cetera. So things like flying a flag on your house, things like having particular nation states IDs. All of these things are their belief systems, their symbols, their tangible things that you can express or show to prove your particular citizenship status, or your ability to be connected to a particular nation state. Local nationalism is a belief that communities that share a cultural identity should have political autonomy, even within similar units of nation states. So local, a good example of local nationalism would be like states, like if you're super proud of where you come from. So like if you're from Texas, for example, and you're very proud to be a Texan, right? You want to be acknowledged within the nation state, but you also want to have that political autonomy to say, I'm sorry, my dog is hearing breaks outside and thinks that there is somebody delivering something. But it's saying that essentially, yes, I belong to this nation, but I'm a Texan, dang it. And that's different than the rest of the parts of the nation. And that Texan status equals XYZ, right? I'm not actually from Texas, but that's not the point. So that kind of helps you kind of understand that. You also see local nationalism in the sense of indigenous groups who want their own political autonomy. They actually want their own sovereignty in a lot of cases. However, because of the way in which that land is operating, their sovereignty is based on the nation state that overruns that territory, in which case their sovereignty is not actually acknowledged or accepted in an international or national level, which causes a whole host of confrontation and conflict. All right, civil liberties are legal rights that are held by citizens in a given community. So these are your legal rights, right? This is a pretty standard across the board thing. You're going to have certain civil liberties depending on where you are or what nation state you're in. Political rights. These are rights of political participation, such as the right to vote in local or national elections held by citizens of the national community. Now, again, your political rights change depending on where you are and what political system you are operating in within your nation state. So just because you have sovereignty as a nation state doesn't mean you're operating in a democratic way, right? Depending on what that nation state is, you're still going to have a wide variety of different opinions, different rights associated with your political participation. And then you have social rights, and your social rights are going to be those that provide you or garner you specific kinds of resources related to society. So that's going to be things like unemployment benefits. It talks about in here sickness payments provided by the state. It's going to talk about your insurance when you retire, retirement, Social Security. These are all kind of social rights that happen in the US, but there are social rights in other countries that include healthcare for everybody, that include social rights such as, I'm trying to think, such as housing for everyone, or et cetera, or even educational social rights, right? We have the social right in the US for education up till the end of high school. However, in some countries, you have the social right to education, including daycare costs from birth until whenever. You have social rights and educational rights for college, etc. There's other countries that do social rights in things like parental leave for or maternity leave for extended periods of time for connections, and that's paid for by the government. So it just kind of depends where you're at, what those social rights look like. A welfare state. Okay, so social rights that are typically achieved through a welfare state is a political system that provides a wide range of welfare benefits for a system. In Western countries, they have an extensive welfare state, which is considered the ideal expression of citizenship's rights. However, in more poorer countries, welfare benefits, exceptional, especially for the poor, are virtually non-existent. So again, really talking about welfare state, we're talking about those social rights that are maintaining your health and well-being. These are housing, these are food, these are healthcare, these are housing, food, healthcare, water. These are your certain basic standard operating procedure that allows you to move through society. We're working towards having things like internet be part of these, because operating in the United States or operating within this particular system that we currently operate internationally, even Wi-Fi is and internet access is vitally important, even within our education system at this juncture. So we talk about things like that. Now, a reminder that even in the US, we have social rights that we do not have social rights that some other countries have. And that includes, things like I was talking about a minute ago, like Medicare or healthcare for everybody, housing for everybody, making sure that food insecurity is different. We have a lot of different social rights than a lot of the other Western countries. However, we also have a lot more welfare benefits, especially for those with economic insecurity, than some of your more poor or less developed countries. All right. A democracy is a political system that allows its citizens to participate in political discussion, decision-making, and or to elect representatives for those decision-making procedures. All right. It seems like something that's super easy, right? You go and you get to hear your voice heard and you get to be made. However, there's a variety of issues that can arise within a democracy and what that's supposed to look like, how it operates, who's in charge, are the people exercising what they think, are they actually doing what people think, what decision making do you get to make as a citizen? Do you get to make your voice heard about particular topics? Or are you only doing that when you elect somebody, when you elect a representative? If you don't have your representative in office, is your voice still heard, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So there's a large amount of questions that come up with democracy and what that is exactly supposed to look like. You have two different kinds of democracies. You have a participatory democracy, which allows all members or a group of community to participate collectively in making major decisions. And then you have direct democracy, which is a form of participatory democracy that allows citizens to vote directly on laws and policies. So we do not necessarily have a direct democracy when it comes to laws and policies. We generally elect somebody who then goes and represents us. Now, that does not mean that they represent us in every vote that they take. A lot of times, no matter who you vote for, even if the person that you voted for gets elected, are they going to vote the way you want them to on every law and every policy? That's just not likely to happen. Because we have a wide range of laws and policies that get voted on any given time. And those laws and policies are not always going to be divided by party lines, are not always going to be something we support, not going to be something that we would necessarily do. Now, on the flip side, we do have certain like state-based laws and policies or maybe addendums to things that we do get to directly vote on in local elections. However, again, who gets the vote is also something that is part of the equation of what makes a democracy different depending on what nation state you're in. All right, so you also have several other different political setups. You have monarchies, which are a system of government in which unelected kings or queens rule. So essentially you have a royal group, some kind of person or family or entity rules over the society, and that person or group of persons gets to essentially make decisions without really having to necessarily consider what it is that the people in that particular society want. Now, that does not mean that that does not get taken into account or does not part of the equation. It just means that it doesn't have to be. Constitutional monarchs are kings or queens, which are largely figureheads. Really, power rests in the hands of political leaders. So a good example of this is in England, right? So like you still have the royal family, but on the flip side, you also have a constitutional based group that gets voted in, and those political leaders still are making decisions. An example of a good monarchy is, or a monarchy that does not necessarily have to acknowledge anybody, Saudi Arabia, the princes and political family that runs that particular area has a lot of power and weight and does not really have to have any kind of other kind of backing when they're making decisions. Then you have liberal democracies, which is a type of representative democracy in which elected representatives hold power. The United States, the Western European countries, Japan, Australia, New Zealand all fall into this category. Now, even in the countries that I just listed, right? Japan, Australia, New Zealand, United States, and all of the Western European countries, there's a wide variety of what democracy looks like that falls within all of these countries, right? So just because you're a democratic country does not mean you operate in the same way. All right, for much of the 20th century, the political systems of the world were divided primarily between democracy and communism. Communism is a social system based on everybody owning the means of production and sharing in its wealth and production. So like what it makes and the wealth that it produces within what they make. While Marx's vision of communism was a more equal society, in practice, communism also often exists in a system of one-party rule. So something to remember is that when Marx thought of this idea of communism, he was really thinking, hey, the people of a country are going to take back their means of production. They're going to say, hey, my labor has value and it's not the value you're giving it. We all need to be equal in society and we need to all be able to make our ends meet, be able to make sure that everything is kind of a more fair and just system. Now, that idea has been turned into essentially those with power and authority then get to make up that communist society, and what we are seeing and considering as communism within the world today and more recently in history since Marx is more of a political ruling of an oligarchy where somebody is at the top or a family or a group of people are at the top and they're saying, yes, we have a communism. Look, everybody gets the same except for the elite at the top. Or everybody gets the same, but that same is going to be vastly, vastly under the ability to actually socially function within that society. And so there's a wide variety of what communism was supposed to look like versus what it looks like now. And again, a lot of that has to do with these concepts of power and authority. Who has it? Who's making the decisions? Who gets to decide what that divide is? What that breakdown of the means of production looks like? Who gets to what hierarchies get to stay in place? Now, if you're making a communist system based out of and continuing the hierarchies of status that already operate, you're not going to have a fair and just system because those hierarchies are already entangled into an unfair and unjust system. So, a reminder that when we talk about Marx as this evil supervillain in society, which often happens within our media, and communism being this god awful thing. Well, communism, when you add in power and authority to a specific elite group of people, is never going to be the communism that Marx envisioned because he was essentially directing his idea specifically around by the people for the people, right? And that can't happen if communism is run by, operated by a specific group of elite oligarchish type individuals. And so we will get into that more. And if you have questions about this, please don't hesitate to ask. I took several Marx classes at EKU in my undergrad, and one of the professors there is still currently studying Marx ideology. I don't agree with everything that Marx said. However, he does have some really good points, and he probably had the best understanding and really comprehensive look at what capitalism is as a system. And so there is some really good things to garner and learn from his writings as a sociologist or somebody that's interested possibly in economics. He was very, very, very good at understanding how economics impacts society and the individual within the society. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to contact me, even if you're just like, hey, I want to have a conversation with this because this is how I understood Marx, and that is totally different than what you're saying. We can hash that out. We can talk about it. We can do whatever you need to help kind of garner an understanding. All right. Internet really does impact democracy and or any kind of governmental rule. Why? Because the internet is a much more global conversation, but it also produces a lot of global inequalities if only certain people have access to it. And that access is limited by or possibly restrained or networked by a governmental entity, right? So like there's a lot of different ways in which the internet is a pro for producing this global conversation, but at the same time, if say you have countries like China or North Korea or Russia that specifically control what media narrative there are, what internet looks like, what you can find on the internet, what you can search for, who you're getting your information from, et cetera. That's going to completely counteract essentially the idea of this free flow of information. Now, also, you have a lot of misinformation on the internet. This is a huge thing. In the 2016 presidential election of Donald Trump, the television still proved to be more important source of information than the internet, and the internet proved to be a source of misinformation during that election, and that misinformation did cause some differentiation in how the election could have been, right? So we had a lot of other countries impacting what memes, what posts were on social media platforms within the internet, and or garnering different internet sites that were fed with a bunch of misinformation, and that did impact how people voted. It did sway in a lot of ways how that political system, how our democracy operated. So the internet has its pros and its cons. But as with anything else, make sure you are vetting what and who you are getting information from always. That is incredibly important as you grow, learn, and become a member of society. All right. Populism and authoritarianism. This is a both a philosophy and a style of governance that is characterized by assertive leadership that values security over civil liberties. It is typically coupled with a strong nationalism that is an anti-immigrant and anti-globalization kind of ideas. Populism is the belief that politics should reflect the needs and interests of ordinary people rather than those of elite individuals or groups. Now, this does not mean that that always is operated by the people for the people, right? Populism is a really good idea in theory, but again, if you are holding that with particularly assertive leadership that is part of the elite group, then what ends up happening is your needs and interests of ordinary people tend to be looked at as the needs and interests of the elite, as opposed to what may garner ordinary people more resources or rights, liberties, social liberties. Authoritarianism is a political system in which the governing bodies or leaders use force to maintain control. So you're going to see this in a lot of countries, that any of the countries that don't have democratic control, but you do see this in some of them that hold other kind of political entities. Again, Russia, North Korea, China, these are very big in their ability to house their governing body and have and maintain control using force whenever they deem necessary. And the they being, again, that assertive leadership. The United States is a representative democracy. Political participation is achieved through elected representatives, right? So we elect people and then they go and they vote on the things, whether it be locally, whether it be nationally, the rules and policies and laws that essentially run the country. Political parties play a key role in elections, while interest groups have significant influence behind the scenes. So this is a big deal, right? And it's something that, as a citizen of the United States, we have to pay attention to. When you are working within your political parties, and as we continue to see this two-party system that doesn't always fit the majority of voters, right? Because very few actually fit into all of this. I only believe everything that these people say. These are all of my beliefs. They are completely represented in this particular political party. That is actually pretty rare within United States voters. However, because we only have these two parties, and because these parties are starkly opposing, and because these parties create that political divide, generally any other kind of party that tries to combat or create another system, voters feel like that takes away or is going to give something they really don't agree with more power, because they're canceling out their vote within a party that might have the chance to beat them. So essentially, generally in the US, voters are looking at who they like least and voting the opposite way, as opposed to forming political parties that may actually increase agreement with that political party by the voters. Due to this winner-take-all electoral system, the United States effectively has only two significant political parties, which is Republicans and Democrats. Again, also pay attention to what interest groups significantly influence these by the money that they put into it, by how they, what's the word I'm looking for, how these interest groups end up influencing their elected officials on laws and policies that these interest groups want for themselves, not for the democracy as a whole or for the people that that democracy impacts or leads. So make sure that you pay attention to what these interest groups are vying for and how they're lobbying. That's the word I was looking for. How they're lobbying for these things within the political process. In recent years, Democrats and Republicans have been increasingly polarized, fighting each other, increasingly nasty towards each other during elections and otherwise, and creating a both divide within people in the country and a political divide that gets not a lot done within its actual political system. All right. Since the early 1960s, the proportion of the population that has turned out to vote has generally decreased, although the recent elections suggest a possible reversal in that trend. Again, young voters and significantly older voters tend to be the two demographics that happen the most. Why? That's because they tend to have the most ability to vote. But that's also broken down. You can break down who is more likely to vote based on age, ethnicity, educational attainment, and income, right? Um, and it also, what is being voted for also will depend on who's voting, right? You're going to have a lot more turnout in a presidential election a year than you are in your yearly local elections. You're going to have a lot more people that want to vote for president that don't want to vote for the maybe school official or the local county clerk. But in some areas, you're going to see the maybe some rural areas that are very much part of their local system and making sure that their sheriff stays this particular sheriff, etc., but may not be as interested in the statewide representative. It just depends on where you're at and who is going to vote and who's going to be the most turnout. Now, significantly, white voters have more access, and they also have more ways in which or opportunities to vote. And I say that based on where voting happens, who is promoted to vote in the way of trying to get people registered, what schools, where that happens, what jobs are allowed to allow you to actually go vote. Now, legally, they are supposed to allow you a 3-hour window to do that. Now, if your lines are 6 hours long, you're not going to be able to stay there, right? Because that doesn't, you can't miss a day of work to do that, especially if your economic prosperity depends on that job or that ability to be present and there, and you're paid an hourly wage, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of different reasons why certain groups are more prominent to vote. Another group that has a lot of issues in being able to vote are those in the trans community or anyone that falls under a gender non-binary grouping, mostly because their records and their appearance are likely different. And so when they go to vote, they're going to get questioned a lot more or hassled on their ability to provide any kind of ID or any kind of records that actively show who they are in a representative fashion. All right. We have one of the lowest turnouts for elections when it comes to nation states in democratic nation states. And a lot of that comes down to how we have changed our education system to decrease conversations or classes regarding civics, regarding voting, regarding these particular things. The US is ranked 31st in voter turnout among the 35 advanced industrial countries that belong to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, right? So of the 35 most industrialized countries, we rank 31st in voter turnout, which really has big impacts because if you can't get voters to turn out, then the people in the country don't get heard and your democratic process becomes less and less democratic because democracy is not, because the people are not part of that democratic process. Of those expressing continuing trust in the government, most vote in presidential elections. Of those who lack trust, most do not vote. Again, if you do not think your political system operates in a democratic way or in a way that promotes what it is that you maintain as important, you're not likely to vote or be part of that process because you don't think it matters, or because you don't think your voice is going to get heard, or there's a good number of reasons why that might be the case. Um, voter registration is not automatic. So in a lot of countries, once you get to a certain age or you get a certain kind of ID, then your voter registration automatically happens. But that is not the case in the US. And there is a wide variety of blocks or social injustices that cause voter registration to be increasingly difficult. Winner take all elections discourage the formation of third parties. Again, we only have two parties, and those two parties rarely speak for the totality of ideas of a single voter. In some states, significant barriers have been raised to make it more difficult for some people to vote, including so-called voter ID laws. Interest groups are groups organized to pursue specific interest in political arena, operating primarily by lobbying for members of legislative bodies. Lobbying is the act of persuading individuals to vote in favor of a cause or otherwise lend support to the aims of an interest group, right? So you're going to have people that go in and lobby to particularly get laws and that get laws and or changes made to laws to garner much more much less influence in the way they operate, maybe business, in the way they operate a social justice movement, in the way that they operate whatever it is that they're lobbying in the name of. In the early women's movement saw the vote as both a symbol of political freedom and a means of achieving greater economic and social equality. If you have more women or you have more of any group, whatever that group is that's vying for their vote, to be able to be part of the political process, you're more likely to have the political needs met of that particular group. Now, a reminder that in the early women's movement, voting was specifically catered towards female upper class women who could, in their attempts to essentially be able to hold property, to have rights to, say, their late husband's estates, to have rights to things that created economic prosperity for those particular groups. The goal was not all women, and that being the fact that any kind of non-white group in the US did not have the right to vote really at this juncture. Women obtaining the vote has not greatly altered the nature of politics, but women's votes do make a difference in elections. So we've seen that in multiple different occasions. Feminist groups have influenced political life on issues such as equal rights, ability of abortion, changes in family and divorce laws, lesbian rights. You're also going to see that when it comes to what your, well, we can get into more of that in a minute. Women in office. So you have a list of people in office that are first, right? So you have Nancy Pelosi as the first of the House, Kamala Harris as the first vice president, female vice president. All of these play central roles in US politics. Still, women remain underrepresented via the population, right? They're nowhere close to the 51% of the population that women actually hold. And then you also have to look at the other identities that we carry, right? So if you look at this through the lens of intersectionality, most of the women that are holding any kind of political position are going to be white women. That is not in totality, But when you look at the demographic population of the United States and the demographic population of the representatives, those two things are going to be wildly different. And that's even for those who are male representatives, right? You're still not going to have that really look like the racial, ethnic, religious, sexuality, all of these categories. When you look at their per population versus per representative, very much it is not going to look the same. And that's just due to a wide variety of factors. All right, democratic elitism is a theory of the limits of democracy. It holds that a larger scale society's democratic participation is necessarily limited to the regular election of political leaders. These ideas are developed by Max Weber and Joseph Schumpeter. We're gonna pretend like I know how to pronounce that word for a minute. And this is essentially just, again, talking about how it's impossible for these large scarce societies to have everybody vote on every specific little thing, right? So if we all voted on every single thing that passed the House floor, the state floor, the all the legislative bodies that we have, including the school board, et cetera, and every single person had to vote on this within that particular group that served, right? So if every single person in the local government had to vote for every single local, plus had to vote for every single state government thing, plus had to vote for every national thing, the likelihood is that there just would not be the time to do that within our economic system, but also it would be incredibly taxing on a governmental system and expensive to make sure that that group is happening. Now, on the flip side, we are also seeing a lot of success when it comes to, say, algorithms that you can plug into that essentially would be able to think about or figure out how you would vote on a lot of things that might be able to in the future someday. You might be able to plug in and answer a questionnaire or something that you deem as important, et cetera, to make sure like we have a democratic process on big social issues. Now, the likelihood that that gets to be part of our political system anytime soon is unlikely. But there are people out there in the social sciences, in the political sciences, who are really looking at how technology could impact our ability to possibly make a reality where we get to vote on a large portion of the decisions that are made in a democratic system. Now, back to Weber, he argued that there are two conditions that must be met for democratic systems to be effective. First, there must be parties that represent different interests and have different outlooks. And second, there must be political leaders with imagination and the courage to escape the inertia of bureaucracy. So you have to have people that essentially are going to be able to operate together, political leaders that are going to be able to operate together and get shit done. And you're going to have parties that represent the people. Now, in a large way, you're going to see some Western countries or Western groups that this is not working in, right? You saw that with Brexit. You saw this with the US in several elections where these two different opposing parties or groups were just not working as a system, and that the system itself is essentially not functioning as well because of the opposition between the two groups, or the inability for people to work together, or the inability to see across lines, et cetera, et cetera. Schumpeter agreed that Weber about the limits of mass political participation and about democracy being important as a method of generalizing or generating effective and responsible government. He also called democracy the rule of the politician, not the people. And that's something that's big, right? Even when we look at our own democracy, a lot of times you're seeing politicians argue with politicians, and they're not necessarily representing, that may be representing maybe the loudest part of their particular base, but they're not going to be representing necessarily the entirety of the demographic in which they or population in which they represent, right? So if they're looking at a good example of this is when we see politicians argue for particular kinds of religious based entities or maybe anti-specific groups kind of laws, when you see a very national support or in favor of rights for these particular groups. Um, so you see a lot of the loudest being heard, but not necessarily um, the people being heard. It's generally very loud politicians or very loud, just in general, interest groups that are going to take control and really be voted for. To achieve voting support, however, politicians must be minimally responsible to the demands and interests of the electoral group. Now, the problem is that if the electoral group does not actually hold accountable the politician because they're like, hey, this big thing that I agree with them on matters more to me than holding them accountable for all these other little votes that I didn't necessarily agree on, then you're not going to see again this mass you're not going to see a lot of change happen because that political system does not have much accountability. All right. Pluralist theories of modern democracy. These theories emphasize the role of diverse and potentially competing interest groups, none of which dominates the political process. A democratic political order involves a balance among competing interests, all having some effect on policy, but none dominating the mechanisms of government. So this is not what we see in the United States. We see specific lobbying groups consistently having their way with our government and our political process. An example of this is the NRA. We also have the medical industrial complex has a lot of reign over who and what makes decisions and why. In our government, we have a lot of big interest groups that then take over and essentially say, I'm going to lobby specifically for this. And because I give you a whole bunch of money, you're going to do it too. And our political process and our politicians do a lot of feeding into those interest groups more so than their electorate because A, they get more money from them in their campaigns, but also B, because they are getting some kind of benefit out of it as an individual, as a person. And so because we do not have kind of that balance within our lobbying system between groups or interests, we see a lot of those interests dominating those mechanisms of government. All right, the power elite, small networks of individuals who, according to C. Wright Mills, hold concentrated powers in modern society. According to Mills, the power elite is composed of mainly white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who are from wealthy families, attend the same prestigious universities, belong to the same clubs, and sit in government committees with one another. Okay, so you see this in a lot of our Western countries, and you see this a lot when it comes to global politics. This group is still similar, though they do have different religious affiliations to an extent now, and you do see some females in it. But if you look at, for instance, who holds the power within, say, major corporations. When you look at major corporations and the board of interest groups, or the board of interest groups, the board members of these particular big companies, you're going to see a lot of crossover. The names are going to keep crossing over, and that matters because then when it comes to lobbying for things, or when it comes to who's making decisions, or who then goes and sits on governmental committees that oversee these things, or who gets put in, for example, who gets to run the EPA. If that is by someone who is a CEO of an oil company, you're going to have a very different EPA than, say, somebody who might be the head of a environmentalist group, right? Those are going to be two very different EPAs. And that's why that matters. So when you see these elite power elites are these groups of people who are controlling a large portion of, say, our media companies or say our food companies or where we get our main nutrition or the companies that control our power and electric grids. All of these things matter because when they start crossing over and they start doing circles, essentially your charts of who's connected to whom, you're also going to see those particular figures being the heads of these interest groups that are funding political party members. And so it's incredibly important to watch how this power elite then chooses to interfere with certain governments or chooses not to interfere with certain governments and why that matters. All right. Part of Mill's argument about the power elite was that the military plays a central role. In a similar vein of thought, President Eisenhower warned the dangers of the military industrial complex, emphasizing the potential for its disastrous role, rise, and misplaced power exists and that it will persist. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. Emerged as the world's unrivaled military superpower, accounting for 36% of the total world military spending in 2017. So think about that for a minute. That's not saying that we spend 36% of our taxes on our military. It's saying that of everyone in the world, every military in the world, all of the money that goes into military spending of every country in the world, 36% of the money that goes into funding militaries goes into the US military, which means that the US public is paying far more than 36% of their taxes to go into their military because we have to essentially keep up with whatever that spending is. We also have, I don't remember the statistic, but we spend several times more. I want to say it's 6 or 7, but it could be more than that now. 6 or 7 times more than the average citizen in other Western countries on military spending and our taxes than do other countries, right? This is a big part of what our tax money goes to. It's a big part of what our government spending goes to. And that has other consequences, right? It means that we have less of those funds to go to other things like education, Medicare costs, Social Security, these kinds of things. But it also means that that money is getting spent on military spending in a way that could be or is creating this military industrial complex that has a large amount of power and a large amount of money, again, to lobby into the government on what it spends, right? So if we're spending money on the military and the military saying, hey, but we're this big industry that creates XYZ planes, military surplus goods, weapons, and they are being sold to other countries. This is part of your economic system. So we're going to lobby with our money to essentially tell you that you need to keep putting into that spending or increase that spending so that we can keep that particular money train coming, which causes a lot of concern amongst voters, amongst those who are paying those taxes, because they want to see that tax money come back in some way as a in some kind of resource, whether it be roads, whether it be schools, whether it be Social Security, et cetera, in a way that helps them as individuals as well. All right. Is democracy in trouble? The US voter turnout in elections has generally declined, and many say that they don't trust politicians. Since 1964, Americans' trust in the government has declined overall, despite the upticks in the 80s and the early 2000s. Despite widespread mistrust, many Americans have favored an expanded rule for government, though through those responses differ sharply along the lines of gender, race, age, and political party. So really thinking about, before we get into the social significance of work, really thinking about politics and whether our democracy in trouble. You see democracies be in trouble when the political leaders consistently don't do the things that their voters want them to do. You see that when it creates political divide, also creates hostility and violence within a nation. You see the decline in democracy when particular rifts or political constraints don't allow for legislation to continue happening. And when people do not have faith in their government, do not have faith in their voting system, choose not to vote, and or have large amounts of barriers between them and voting. So I'm going to stop there for now, and I'll come back to this, and we're going to get into economics and work.